Welcome to the How to Buy or Sell a Business Successfully podcast. The concepts discussed in this podcast are for informational purposes only. No attorney-client relationship is intended or formed by this podcast. No legal advice is intended in the substance of this podcast. Feel free to check out our website, www.goforemanlaw.com. Enjoy the show and welcome your hosts, Jake Wayman and Sam Foreman. Welcome back to another episode of How to Buy and Sell a Business Successfully. Today we're going to talk about medical or dental practice partner buyouts. So folks that are buying out a partner in a practice. Today we're grateful to be joined by Jennifer Allen, who is the head of the healthcare department over at Adams Brown. Thank you for joining us again, Jennifer.
Thanks.
Yeah, and we're also joined by Logan Woodbridge, who is a banker at Sunflower Bank. Logan, you're joining us for the first time today. Why don't you tell our listeners something really interesting and or entertaining about yourself?
Ooh, man. You know, there's not a lot about me that's entertaining.
Okay.
But although bankers are known for entertaining people, I am also a scuba diver on the side.
Oh, that's interesting.
Did not know that. Yeah. So if there's anything that you want to talk about scuba diving wise on the podcast, please have me back.
Okay. I do not, but thank you for bringing it up.
Right. I appreciate you having me on.
If our listeners would like to, we'll put Logan's personal contact information and home address in the show notes. No, we won't. That's definitely not happening. All right. Jacob, I think you've got our first question today.
Yeah, to kick it off, I mean, buying a practice or buying a partner out isn't free. As we know, money doesn't fall from the sky. So really how can sellers help manage the cost and timing of the deal? You're in this process, you're a partner in a dental or medical practice and you're looking to buy out somebody. What can you do to help really manage those costs and the timing of it? Talk a little about what that looks like as you prep for it.
Yeah, so
Logan, you want to start?
Yeah, I'll go first. So for us as a bank, and I'm sure it's very similar to being on the attorney side or on the CPA side, we just like to get involved early. So we like to see the whole deal team involved as early as possible. So we don't want to be kind of coming to the table last, trying to scramble and get a structure in a quick time frame. So if you start having that conversation with the owner, hey, we're kind of thinking about buying out or buying into, I should say, start talking to us now. Let's get those documents. Let's get the structure that you want in place so we can start off from the very get-go to where both parties want to be.
Yeah, I think just, understanding what your motivation is as the seller, to understand what you're asking for so that there doesn't have to be multiple reiterations of processes, because if you change your mind, that can easily add to the cost and delay some of the timing. And so having a clear picture of what you're wanting, not saying that it has to be perfect, but lined out, but really know what is kind of the deal breakers for you and what are the things that it is a negotiation. So you're probably not going to get everything exactly perfect. And so understanding what that looks like for you is, I must have this, and this would be nice.
In a perfect world, how long does this process typically take from infancy, from starting the conversations to the deal is done? How long do you guys typically see that happening?
Typically, we get things financed between 30 and 45 days, depending on how complex the deal is. Like I said, the earlier that we get in, the more time and the quicker that we can get it done. But it's usually in between that time frame.
On the accounting side, a lot of it is just depending on the educational knowledge of both the buyer and the seller, and what their comfort level is, how much time you can actually commit to this, because it's not something that you just sign on a dotted line that somebody else has put together. You really need to understand the transaction of it. And so, usually there can be a lot of stuff kind of worked through at the same time. Logan can be working on the financing side at the same time that your attorney and your CPA are working out the details and working through the tax implications of it at the same time. So, but if you pick one and are only working on the financing side for a while, and then you bring the attorney and the CPA in, or vice versa, that's where you really need to bring everybody in at the same time.
Yeah. As we look at this from the perspective of somebody who's being bought out and what that process looks like for them, Logan, from a financing perspective, if you're the selling partner, if you will, what should you expect from the, kind of the financing process?
Yeah, so we're going to do what, and if it's somebody's first time, they'll probably think is a pretty deep dive into their financials and in their practice. A lot of times, the doctor may have been working in the same practice for the last 30 years, right? So they see it as their baby. They've worked their butts off for it, right? But we'll come in and just make sure that everything is where it needs to be. From a financial side, we really focus on the last 3 years just because that shows where the practice is going. But they may find that it's just really in depth, but it's both good for the seller and the buyer that happens, because we can come and ask questions that maybe they didn't think of going into it.
Sure. So somebody that's selling out their ownership interest in let's say there's a group of 5 doctors or something like that, and they're selling out their ownership interest, they should expect that, the bank that's financing for the buyer, whether that's their other doctors in the practice or some new doctor coming in, that, they've got to know and understand what is the asset that's really driving, the payment of this loan terms. And so they're going to want to know, what does the financial performance of the practice look like, so that the bank can make sure the bank's going to get paid back.
We typically like that.
Makes sense. But for sellers that, especially as you described, they've been in the practice for a long time, it may have been a long time since they maybe did their own practice buy-in, and maybe it looked completely different. So, they need to be prepared for that sort of level of transparency and, that kind of scrutiny that they might go through in the process. Jennifer, when you're looking at working with folks that are, selling out their interest in a practice, and so there's kind of a partial practice buyout, for example, for the tax side of things, what does that selling owner really need to be thinking about from the tax perspective?
Yeah, really what it is, what are the tax implications depending on the type of entity, whether it's a partnership or an S corporation, whether or not they are selling out all of their interests or just part of it. Are you selling, if you're a 50% owner and you're going to sell and you're still going to remain a 20% owner, that's a different story than if you were selling all 50% of your interest and you were completely getting out. And so, it may still stay a partnership or an S corporation, depending on how that works. And so really needing to understand what type of entity structure you are, what type of cash do you require up front, or are you okay? Is it beneficial and something that you would like to have that's, taken out over a few years with installment treatments, and really understand the tax implications, but also, what walk away money does this look like? After Uncle Sam's paid for and after all of the debt is paid off, if you have to satisfy some bank loans and things like that with your interest, what is your walk away cash, and understanding the timing of that.
No, that's really good. I think an additional item for folks to track with when they're selling is, if they've got any kind of personal guarantees, if they've got any guarantees on, the practice debt or, some kind of financing arrangement for equipment or something like that, understanding how those are going to work after the closing. Are they going to be released? Is it something where there's going to be an indemnification for those? Jennifer, a follow-up question is, when a doctor's sold, do they need to be either in their contract or just thinking about generally what could happen with prior year tax returns for the practice?
Sure. So when you're selling the assets, you are still on the hook for, issues in the past. If you've sold your stock, that is a different category. And so that buyer has taken on that liability if they have bought your stock. But if they have bought your assets, that is a different piece. And so understanding, if it's just a partial buyout, what did they buy? Did they buy your interest in the partnership? Did they buy your portion of the assets, what that looks like.
Mm-hmm. And do folks ever run into issues where, okay, I sold out completely, or I sold out part of my ownership, and then the majority owners in the practice went and amended a tax return for a prior year, for example, and created some sort of adverse tax consequence for a selling owner?
I have not seen that in most of the deals. They're usually addressed that in the agreement, in the legal agreement, that
Sure.
Something like that would be handled, and it would be taken into consideration before anything is actually filed.
Sure.
So.
No, that's great. And so making sure that, if you're selling, you're aware of what the practice could do in terms of amending prior returns, or how they're going to handle audits, because you may have tax exposure even after, even after selling your ownership for what happened in prior tax years, and making sure that that's really clearly addressed in your contracts about how that's going to work, and that at a minimum, you get a great tax advisor to take a look over it and be able to tell somebody how it's accurately supposed to be done. And we've been through that process before,
Yes.
and it helped the client a lot.
It did.
So
Sometimes not everyone knows what is in their operating agreement. And so,
Yeah.
A business can be in business for 10 or 15 years and nobody's actually pulled the operating agreement out until a new partner decides to come in, and we kind of dust that off and really dig into it and say, ooh, this has been maybe hasn't been addressed and hasn't been treated the way the current document states it should be.
Guilty.
We occasionally have even really good clients that forget what's in their documents. So, but no, that's really helpful. And so, folks always need to be mindful when they are leaving ownership in a practice, when they're selling it, thinking about things like tax distributions. And is there something clear in their sales agreement that is going to make sure that if they're expecting to receive a final tax distribution for income that they're going to have to pay taxes on, that's really clearly spelled out, that, hey, here's what I'm going to get, so that you don't have any unwelcome surprises after the deal. Hey, where's my money? What money? Yeah. Don't do that. Logan, I've got a quick question for you. A quick question. Only a quick question.
How long do I have?
You have 4.7 seconds to answer this question. When somebody is selling their ownership in a practice, should they, will they ever be asked to guarantee, or, provide any kind of collateral, or be in any kind of subordinated position if they're providing any kind of financing to the buyer? What should they expect from that process as far as the bank's concerned?
Yeah. So, as you know, banks just want to make sure they get paid back, right? So,
right. Good answer. All right. Next question. No.
4.7 seconds.
There you go.
No, we usually ask for a commercial guarantee, right? So, the buyer comes in, we have them guarantee, and we have the business guarantee as well. So from the seller side, we don't really ask for them too much personally, but obviously they own part of the business. So their business that they are an owner of has to guarantee for that buyout.
Gotcha. No, that's helpful. From a diligence perspective, Jennifer, what kinds of things, when someone is selling a practice, do you want to help make sure that or selling ownership in a practice? What kind of things do you really want to make sure that your client, early on in the process is, teeing up the buyer for, to make sure that they're on the same page so they don't run into surprises later on in the process?
Sellers are, this is their livelihood, and, getting a feel for the fact that you don't want this buyer to be unsuccessful. You want to successfully transition this practice to them. And so understanding, are they going to treat your patients with the same level of respect, your staff with the same level of respect, really kind of understanding that on the people side. Sometimes that gets a little too people-y for some of our providers, and they'd prefer to stay out of that piece of it. But otherwise, some of them will say, I want to protect my team. more than being focused on the financial numbers of it. And so really kind of just digging into what makes the most sense for that seller.
That's good stuff. Logan, similar question for you. When you've got a client that is selling their ownership in a practice, are there things that you're flagging for them early to say, hey, make sure you've talked to, the buyer about this in the process? And
yeah. I mean, what kind of piggybacking off what Jennifer said, culture is a big thing in any business, right? So we really make sure that the seller knows the buyer, knows it's going to be a good fit for long term, because obviously when they're selling their practice or selling parts of their practice, that they want to keep the culture how it's going to be, right? We don't want someone coming in, buying into a practice that's going to try to change up a lot of stuff and make a successful practice be less successful. So from a business standpoint, we just make sure there's going to be a good fit and make sure that they know that we're looking at that too. No,
that's great.
Well, and kind of to piggyback off that is like when you're going through the process on financing these, are you requiring them to put a plan together? Like kind of like in the SBA process. I mean, is there a business plan that they have to be putting forward, even though it's already an existing business, still saying, hey, well, this is what I'm going to do over the next 2 to 3 years?
Yeah. I mean, from the seller standpoint, we do ask them to do that, right? Mm-hmm. We want to know their plan over the next 5 years, really, of, hey, are you going to sell a portion of it and then sell a bigger portion? Is this guy going to come in and fully buy you out in 5 years? So we want to know, as a bank that wants a full banking relationship and a long-term relationship, what does this look like down the road so that we can be prepared to help you out when that time's ready?
Yeah. Well, and kind of so the final question, this will be for both whoever wants to jump in on it, but what's your best advice to help sellers have a successful deal?
Jennifer, go first.
Truly understand what their goal is. And I think I had mentioned this on one of the previous podcasts, but, really understanding what makes the most sense, what's their driver, what's their must-have, what's their, deal breaker, and then understanding the tax consequences, because those checks are probably, when you sell a practice, either the full interest or a partial interest, it's probably some of the biggest checks you'll write to Uncle Sam. And so it can be a scary process, but really understanding, what is the amount that you're going to end up getting to walk away from.
Don't write checks you but can't cash.
Yeah.
How about you, Logan?
Yeah, once again, to piggyback off her, have a plan, right? Mm-hmm. Come in and don't just say, well, I got offered a decent amount of money for this percentage of my practice. Say, what's it going to look like in another 5-10 years? Are you wanting to bring somebody else on? And really know, from a banking standpoint, know your financials, right? Like, come in and be able to help us answer questions to structure the deal right for you and for the buyer as well.
Yeah, absolutely.
Good stuff. Well, hey, thank you everyone for joining us for another episode. And thank you, Jennifer and Logan, for joining us. And please, to our listeners, stay tuned in. We encourage you to subscribe to our podcast, like, follow, whatever. If you're going to leave us reviews, we do ask that you do one of two things. Either leave us a 5-star review, which is our preference, or if you feel so inclined to leave us a 1-star review, we ask that you only do so if you're going to leave really colorful comments, because those are really fun to read if you do. Thank you all for joining us, and have a wonderful day. Thank you for joining us today. For future episodes, please subscribe to the podcast on Apple Podcasts or Spotify. And please check out our website at www.goforemanlaw.com/learning.